Good afternoon, or perhaps even good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Bina Chester, and I'm Resilience First Director of Operations and Communications, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this Resilience First webinar in partnership with the National Preparedness Commission. So for those of you who were unable to view the opening video, Resilience First, together with our strategic partner, the Resilience Shift, have formed the world's largest global business network. And as a business-led membership organization, we provide the ways and means to drive resilience at scale in a world facing deep uncertainties and complex interdependencies. We do this by enabling businesses to collaborate, share, and co-create resilience best practice for mutual benefit and for that of society. The title of today's webinar is Resilience Reimagined. It is based on a report commissioned by the National Preparedness Commission and completed by Cranfield University and Deloitte. The full title of the report is Resilience Reimagined, a practical guide for organizations. It presents insights from business leaders from a range of sectors and makes 7 recommendations for organizations on how to become more resilient, drawing on lessons from the past 12 months. The report warns we are entering a new period of uncertainty and change, and with an ever-increasing possibility that things will go wrong. It sought answers from leading figures about how resilience can be developed, who does it well, and what businesses can learn from them. It also outlines practical steps necessary to strengthen resilience for long-term success and makes recommendations to business leaders on what more they can do to help their organizations to develop their ability to cope. So to help us shed further light on this valuable report, I'm delighted to welcome today's 4 guests, 2 of whom are the main authors from Cranfield University, while a third is from Deloitte, and a 4th is from Santander UK, who will present a business perspective to the report's findings. To lead us through the proceedings, I am pleased that the chairman of the National Preparedness Commission will also be the chair of this session, Lord Toby Harris. Lord Harris will offer some opening remarks by way of scene setting and will then introduce the speakers in turn. Throughout the session, I welcome you and I encourage you to ask questions of the speakers by posting your questions in the chat box to the right. Lord Harris, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Bina. So as this is a joint event, I'd like to add to the welcome on behalf of the National Preparedness Commission to this webinar to discuss the report Resilience Reimagined, prepared for the Commission by Cranfield University with the support of Deloitte. Just a word on the housekeeping. Please can I ask you to put comments and questions in the chat function, and we will try and pick up as many of the points as possible in the discussion. Now, for those new to the National Preparedness Commission, I should explain that the Commission brings together 45 leading figures from public life, academia, business and civil society. It had its first meeting last November, but in fact the Commission was conceived before COVID hit. And the last year, under the pandemic, has highlighted how vital its central purpose to promote better preparedness in the UK for a major crisis or incident has become. Now, this is not just a matter for national government, and there is welcome recognition of this in the integrated review that the UK government published a few weeks ago that explicitly promises a comprehensive national resilience strategy based on a whole of society approach involving individuals, businesses and organisations. Indeed, as the Commission has been saying since it was established, making every level of government, every organisation and every community more resilient creates a sort of, if I dare use the phrase, a sort of herd immunity for a society that is better able to address future global crises, whether it's a new pandemic or a massive cyber attack or climate change. And that is also true for each household and every individual. We all have to play our part. Genuinely, as somebody once said, we are all in it together. Now, the Commission's work programme over the next year or so will focus on a number of major themes: creating organisational resilience, building cross-sectoral resilience across the public and private sectors, harnessing the power of the market so that it pays to be resilient, building society and community resilience, preparedness in place, that means what constitutes a resilient city or locality, and the links between resilience and the net zero agenda. And it's the first of these themes, creating organisational resilience, that brings us to the subject of today's webinar and the Cranfield report on Resilience Reimagined that we published 6 weeks ago. The report looks at how businesses responded to COVID-19 so as to better identify what businesses will need to do to make themselves more resilient in the future. The research was based on interviews and discussions with 50 senior leaders from large companies and organisations, and found that most had, at best, struggled through the pandemic and were ill prepared for the disruption it caused. But that's probably enough by way of introduction. The format we will follow is that I'm going to ask the report's authors to describe what they did and their findings. I will then invite Rick Cudworth from Deloitte, who supported the work and is the Resilience and Crisis Management Lead for Deloitte, followed by Mike Butler, the Chief Resilience and Control Officer of Santander UK, to make some brief comments before opening up the discussion more generally. So first, I would like to invite David Denyer, Professor of Leadership and Organisational Change at Cranfield School of Management, together with his colleague Mike Sutcliffe, who, apart from being a distinguished cricketer, directs the Resilience Grand Challenge project at Cranfield, to introduce the report. Over to you both.
Thank you, Toby. That's really kind. Thanks for the introduction, Bina, as well. As you've described, the report was a really exciting project for us to look at how organisations can prepare for disruptive events, taking a lens from not just COVID-19 pandemic, but also the 2008 financial crisis. I think it's widely accepted that the financial sector have taken great strides in this direction. We interviewed leaders, as you suggest, from a range of different sectors, from water, from energy, from the environment, from transport, from manufacturing, from food, retail and logistics, defence and security, ICT and hospitality. It's fair to say that it affected leaders from the different sectors in different ways, and we tried to consolidate the learnings into a very practical report for leaders across the organisation or across different sectors. It's also worth saying that a lot of fantastic efforts have been made in this space over the years in fields such as enterprise risk management, business continuity management, crisis incident management and disaster recovery. These systems have traditionally helped us predict, prevent and protect organisations from threats, but we believe resilience extends beyond that and isn't purely defensive in nature. Without covering too much more background, I want to get into the details. So I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to talk through the 7 practices that we've described, that we've learned from these interviews. And there's also a nod to the maturity of an organisation in terms of its resilience, and also how one might measure organisational resilience. So from there, I'll hand over to David.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here to discuss our report on Resilience Reimagined, which is freely available. If you haven't got a copy already, you'll be able to get a copy from the National Preparedness Commission website, or from Deloitte, or from Cranfield website, or from social media. In the report, as Mike said, we talk about 7 practices for organizations, for practical steps that organizations that responded well to the crisis, that we think have a higher level of maturity in terms of their resilience, and what they actually do. What are the practical steps that they actually implement in the organization that builds this resilience? And I think is very different to our traditional approach to thinking about risk and resilience. I've been in this field for nearly 20 years. And for most of that time, I think risk resilience has been a fairly technical discipline that's usually been managed by a specialist unit within an organization who own that skill set and that knowledge. And what I think you're seeing all the time and amplified by COVID is a shift to risk and resilience being a strategic leadership issue. It's something that is managed at board level with senior management team. It's on the agenda. It isn't something that's done on a annual basis, but is something that is lived and breathed by those organizations. And I think that's one of the sort of significant shifts that we've seen over recent years. And as I say, I think really been amplified by the pandemic. But of course, pandemic isn't the only risk and threat that faces organizations. And there are many other things that we need to be resilient for now and in the future. So with that in mind, I want to just talk through these 7 practices that we see in the organizations that came out of our research. And I'm just going to go through these in turn. And obviously, there's a lot more information in the report. But what this will hopefully do is stimulate some discussion and raise some questions for you. And if you want to place those in the chat, as been said, would be fantastic. So the first practice that we see in these resilient organizations, a clear differentiator, and I think the thing that starts the resilience and practice of resilience is that those organizations that we spoke to that were more resilient discuss future failure. And it's easy to say, but I think one of the issues that we see all the time is that crisis events, disasters, disruptions have been termed a failure of imagination, i.e. those organizations just cannot imagine that these things will happen. They are seen as such low probability that we don't put anything in place in order to avoid, trap or mitigate those issues. Whereas in the resilient organizations, what they did was to make the discussion about failure, about problems, about future challenges part of the agenda. It was on the agenda. It was a key discussion point. There was an openness and a psychological safety for people to raise their concerns. And I think as an underpinning cultural item, the ability to talk about future failure, constantly ask the question, what if and what next, really underpins a culture of resilience. So for us, the number one underpinning cultural item was this openness to discuss failure, and where organizations are only looking at past success and say, it won't happen here, we are different, we've got systems and processes in place to prevent these things, then that's where we saw lower levels of resilience. So that was our first practice. Our second practice was that the resilient organizations really look at the whole system in which they operate, and they can consider the connections within that system. And what was really interesting to us was that they looked at the system in terms of 5 capitals. So there was a focus on obviously financial capital and financial resilience. There was a focus on operations and operational resilience. There was a focus on reputation and reputational resilience. There was a focus also on human resilience and the well-being of staff and the importance of people to resilience. And then there was also a focus on the natural capital and the environmental impact that those organizations have. And looking holistically at the whole system through a 5 capital lens helped them understand not only the inputs to resilience, because all 5 of them are crucial to building resilience, but also the impact they were having on the system around them in terms of those 5 categories. What it also did was it put resilience as a strategic social contract that the organization has to deliver and do no harm across those 5 capitals. And I think what this helped those organizations do was avoid silo thinking, where we often see risks in silos, organizations are structured in silos, and also consider the impact that they are having on the whole system. One of the real differences that we see in financial services in particular was a 2017 discussion paper that put resilience on the map and asked organizations to attend to a number of questions. One of those questions was, what are the threats that are facing your organization and the sector? How are you demonstrating your resilience? But they also asked what I thought was a fundamental question, which was, what is the contribution that your organization makes to the resilience of the sector and the system in which you operate? And I think looking outside the organization is absolutely crucial to resilience. So that was the second practice. The third one was absolutely essential in that those organizations that were resilient really understood what was important to their end users, and they focused on their essential outcomes. And we define essential outcomes as the outcomes that must be delivered to this key stakeholder, the end user. So if you are a financial services organization, a core service, an essential service might be the ability of people to make a payment using a credit card. If you're a water company, it might be the delivery of drinkable water. If you're a university like we are, it's the continuation of your education offer and your teaching. Once they'd identified what those core outcomes were, we move on to the fourth practice, which was that they defined what the tolerable impact thresholds were for each of those essential services. So for a financial services organization, what is tolerable in terms of an impact when people can't make a payment? Is that an hour, 2 hours, a day, 2 days, a week? What about drinkable water? What about teaching provision? What is the disruption to the end user, and what's a tolerable limit? What's the thresholds of that? And then working back from that to understand the resilience of the system that kept those organizations able to deliver those essential services within impact thresholds. That links to our fifth point, which is about those organizations, once they look back at the delivery of those outcomes, their impact thresholds, have some strategic choices to make in terms of how they build resilience. What we see in so many organizations is they often only take one strategy, but we identify in the research 4 strategies. The first strategy is you can put more controls in place to prevent problems, more system, more process, more compliance, which is where everyone tends to go. But you can also look at the delivery of the essential outcomes and say, okay, are there alternatives? What options do we have? How do we build flexibility into the delivery of those outcomes? Our third choice that we have is how do we optimize to do more of what we've always done, maybe delivering to the same markets with the same services, but we get better and better. So it's about optimizing our existing systems. And yet our fourth choice is that we do something completely different. We completely innovate and look at the future and say, what's it going to take to be fit for the future? And often resilience is about making the change now to be fit for the future. And so those 4 choices of more control, more flexibility and responsiveness, more optimization or more innovation were 4 choices those organizations had. And they balanced those 4 choices rather than what I see in a lot of organizations is we only go to put more controls in place and more prevention when we have disruption. What they then do, our 6th thing, is that they stress test the system. Continuously stress test using severe and plausible scenarios. But what they also do is, and it's slightly different to what you see in many organizations, and was summarized by one of our interviewees that said, we made a breakthrough when we stopped playing hurricanes. And what that person meant by that was, if you bring your senior management team together and you say, right, we're going to do a hurricane scenario, a flood scenario, a cyber attack scenario, a terrorist attack scenario, then what people will naturally do is say that's so low probability is one thing. The other thing that they tend to do is try and bring in a load of technical details about what that would actually entail. And it confuses. What the resilient organizations did was ran some scenarios around some business assumptions. So going back to a couple of my examples from earlier, and maybe the university one is obviously the one I know. Can you deliver those outcomes, those teaching outcomes, education outcomes, deliver your courses if you can't access 20% of your staff? For whatever reason, 20% of your staff can't work. Can you deliver the outcomes? Can you stay within your impact thresholds? What if that's 30%? What if it's 40%? Now, what if we take out 2 of your buildings, or we disrupt your supply chain, or we take out some of the critical infrastructure? Now, how do you deliver your essential outcomes? And by working through a set of business assumptions as the basis of scenarios. It really identifies at what levels do we drop below that impact threshold and we can no longer deliver the outcomes. And of course, that helps us because it's much more measurable in terms of those impact thresholds to make business cases for the investment in resilience that we need. The underpinning one, number 7, last one I want to talk about, is about the role of leadership. What we saw in these organizations was resilience was both led at the top of the organization, driven by the board, owned by the board, the senior management team, but it was also distributed through the organization. So everyone felt some accountability and some ownership for the resilience agenda. And they did 3 things, which are also linked practices. What we see in terms of the resilience agenda in those organizations were a sense of direction. Everyone knew the purpose of resilience, a sense of alignment across boundaries and borders and connectivity and communication. So everything was aligned across the organization, and a strong commitment to resilience. So direction, alignment, commitment as the principles of leadership that underpins resilience. As Mike mentioned, in the back of the report, we also offer a maturity model that offers 5 levels of maturity. And the intent there is that you'll be able to look at that and maybe self-assess where you think you are on your journey and what steps you might want to take to move up a level of maturity. In the report, we also talk about measuring resilience, and we talk about 4 R's of resilience, which might help us think about some of the KPIs and some of the measures. We think resilience has these 4 R elements. Firstly, it's about readiness. Are you ready for a disruptive event? If disruptive events happen, how responsive are you? So the second R was around responsiveness, and you might think about how we might measure that responsiveness. The third element is about recovery, the speed of recovery of your core business outcomes. And the fourth one was about regeneration. It's about the innovation. It's about bouncing back and bouncing forward and being fit for the future. So 4 R's of readiness, responsiveness, recovery, and regeneration as being outcomes around resilience that we might be able to put some KPIs and some measures to. So those were the core elements of the report. And I'm now going to hand to Rick and to Mike to discuss it.
Rick,
yeah, hi there. Thanks, Toby. Thanks, David. And I think an excellent summary there, David, of what is a full report. A couple of thoughts from me on it as well. I think the 7 practices that you talked about so well there are very much sort of emerging practices, as you say, that we're seeing in organisations who perhaps perform better in terms of resilience at the moment. But there is some alignment and I think coalescence with other recent reports, which is worth reflecting on as well. So about a year ago, we had the National Infrastructure Commission report on resilient infrastructure systems. And they've made a number of recommendations in their reports. And, a couple of them, for example, one of them is about setting levels of service in disruption, which is very much like equivalent to the impact thresholds you talked about. They talked about as well demonstrating resilience through stress testing, which again is very much one of the practices that's been drawn out in the report. The other area, I know in financial services, we looked at financial services as part of the research for the report, and clearly a lot of work went in post the financial crisis to improve the financial resilience of the sector and of individual firms. But there's an increased amount of focus right now on operational resilience in those firms as well across the sector. And there's some real similarities in the approach the regulators and the firms are now taking to strengthening operational resilience in financial services to the 7 practices that you've outlined there. There's a real strength of alignment there. Thirdly, very recently, Go Science, and you may not know of Go Science. They're a government body, but they run SAGE, which I'm sure you have heard of through the pandemic many times. But they published a really good toolkit on futures thinking, and that's very much part of supporting the practices around discuss future failure and instill futures thinking in organizations, the first practice you talked about. So I think it's good to see that sort of alignment and coalescence of thinking coming through, not just from the report that we've produced here, but from various other things recently. And then if I look slightly further forwards, I think of interest and relevance to all of this discussion is the recent consultation paper put out by BEIS, the government department here, on restoring trust in audit and corporate governance. And in that consultation paper, they've made the recommendation that organizations should include a resilience statement in their reporting, in their annual reporting. We'll see where that goes, but I think that would be a powerful sort of pull to improve resilience as well. And the second piece that's come out very recently, of course, is the integrated review from the government and the implicit recognition, I think, as Toby said here about herd immunity, that to make the country more resilient, each and every organization is key to this and building their overall resilience. So I think that as well is important. So David and Mike, I think you've done a fantastic job, not just there in summarizing the emerging practices, but in pulling it all together in the paper. And I think when you put those 7 practices together in particular, you start to get a sort of systematic approach to improving organizational resilience. And I think that systematic approach will become hopefully a sort of foundational way that organizations will approach resilience going forwards and do it in a very practical way. So those would be just a few thoughts from me building on the paper.
Okay, and now Mike Butler. Mike.
Thanks, Toby. I have to say, first of all, I thought this is an exceptional report. Very, very well written, very, very accessible. And it was, when I was reading, I was like, yes, this is great. These are great concepts, great ideas, and they're very well written to bring to life to an audience that perhaps is less familiar than we are in financial services, where there's been a lot of focus on this. And a couple of things that really jumped out to me was the recognition of the shift that we have to go through, not just in financial services, but really in planet Earth, from this reactive focus of resilience, right? And I think the disciplines of business continuity and disaster recovery, some of you will have heard me say things like BCM is dead, long live resilience. And what I mean by that is, don't just focus on recovery and the reaction. Really important, and the paper makes that clear as well, that it's really important to still expect failure, but be much, much, much more focused on proactive elements of it. Start to look at the horizon, start to think about what those trends and threats are. It came out in some of the documentation that Rick was referring to through the consultation paper and others, that we are encouraged to think much more, be much more forward thinking, forward looking, to think about what could happen to us, or what did happen to someone else and could happen to us. Are we as well prepared to resist that threat, and therefore reduce the likelihood of an outage or failure impacting our ability to provide services to our customers? So I thought that was exceptional. The other couple of points that really resonated with me were almost the language that we had in the that you guys are using. I'm conscious I've kind of gone a bit blurry, but the language that was used in there, I think, brought to life a lot of the better concepts, rather than some of the language we tend to use in the financial services now, and some of the policy statements, which were much more geared towards how a bank works, and thinking about the outcome elements of it much more clearly, and essential outcomes is really, really important. And I think really brings to life that view much more clearly when we start to think about the customer element of a business service in financial services. Outcome elements, or essential outcomes, are really important elements that we need to start thinking about. And lastly, I've talked a bit about transformer companies and sort of agile companies, and thinking about agile resilience and all sorts of different buzzwords to try and describe it. But actually what it is, it's that balance of strategic choices. It's getting to a point where you are expecting failure, you're prepared for failure, and you can start to plan around it, so that you're not just surviving through a disruptive event, either as a small business, as a large multinational, or an individual, but you're actually thriving and flourishing through that as well, and can provide the support you need to provide to your customers. And so all of the concepts that we've been kicking around for a while in the operational resilience space in financial services are brought to life really, really well in this paper. And I really enjoyed reading it and scribbling all over it, going, yes, yes, exclamation mark, yes, because I think it is a very, very powerful document and something which I would encourage everyone to read and share, whatever sector you're in.
Well, thank you very much for those contributions. And can I ask the panel to turn their videos on and so we can have a more general discussion? The messages that came across to me most strongly were that those businesses and organisations that coped best were the ones that already understood what was most important to their customers and therefore what were the most essential things to continue to deliver as the crisis unfolded. And these businesses had examined in advance alternative ways of delivering those core services and had developed the ability to cope under pressure no matter what. The corollary, of course, is that such a business or organisation is not only able to respond and adapt more effectively to a threat, but also to an opportunity. And as a result, is likely to be generally more successful. And that ties in with one of the comments that have been put in the chat about is the evolution of resilience leading to sustainability or the longevity of organisations. And I don't know if any of you want to comment on that.
I suppose, if I may, just because that was relevant to the last point I was just making as well. And I completely agree. I think that the world is shifting so quickly now that if you're not forward looking and thinking about how disruptive events could affect your business or just shifts in patterns could affect your business, then which I think is really a core part of resilience, then you are not going to be able to survive as successfully as some other businesses who have that ability to adapt. Mike, I know you were going to say something there as well.
Yeah, to build on that point exactly, Mike. We are regularly asked whose job is resilience and how does it become sustainable? And we've seen a shift and we've recognised a shift through our discussions from it being the bastion of the chief risk officer or the chief resilience officer to something that the CEO or the P&L owner takes responsibility for, because it confers a strategic advantage. And that really feels like a step shift in the right direction.
Do you think that there are things that government can do to create a climate that facilitates that sort of shift?
I'll pick it up there, Toby. I think there is, for sure. I think first and foremost, organisations need to do this because it's a good thing to do, not just in terms of the social contract that David talked about, but for their long-term sustainability, which we just talked about as well, and for strategic advantage. That's the sort of push, if you like, and I hope the report like this provides some of that push. It gives some of the practices you can use to help achieve that. But I think government can also create the pull, and things like the recommendation of a resilience statement is an example of creating the pull. The financial sector regulators, with the policy around operational resilience they've introduced for financial services, creates a pull. And I think we need a bit of both. Actually, we need that push and we need a pull, and I think government definitely can provide that.
Anyone else at that point? I can see Mike has leant forward. Maybe that's just shifting his position, but
just purely comfort.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned this when I was just going through the 7 practices, but I think there's a role to play in just generating a conversation, and there's a role for regulators to generate that conversation. I think that's one of the things we saw in financial services was a requirement for organizations to respond and start discussing how they were going to be resilient, how are they going to demonstrate their resilience. But I really like this additional question, which is, so what is the contribution that your organization makes to the sector, to the system in which you operate, which makes us think outside of our own organizations to a bigger picture. And one thing that COVID really demonstrated to us was how interconnected and independent everything is, and how a threat that starts off in China can quickly sweep around the world and affect every sector, every system. As we move forward with more globalization and more integrated technologies in particular, we are all interconnected, and therefore thinking just beyond the organizational boundaries, I think, is absolutely essential to build resilience for the future.
If I can just add to that as well, David, because I think that when we talk about companies that can thrive and flourish and survive through that, I don't necessarily see that as just being a competitive advantage. I think that there are no winners in financial services if one bank happens to be more resilient than the other bank, right? The whole sector is impacted by a failure in one of the systemic banks. So we have to work together in a way that we never thought that perhaps prior to an operational resilience lens being applied on things, we never thought we'd be able to do. And I think that one of the key things, and there's a couple of questions that are coming around COVID response, and I won't answer all of them now because there's probably a few other opportunities for that. But what it has shown is that the theory of recovery from a COVID-like event has been very different to the reality of sustaining the UK economy and the way that we actually live. No one would have ever thought up to the point at which it started happening, and certainly today would never think that some 18 months nearly later that we would still be in a lockdown situation, that we would still be working from home, doing a virtual conference, but actually largely able to maintain the economy and the flow of services to the UK population.
Yeah, and I think Mike, that's a really key point, and the papers really does focus on this resilience of outcomes, and you know that's a clear example we've had to go through COVID. It's not just been focusing on recovery to get back to offices to continue the outcomes. We found an alternative way very often to deliver the outcomes. The other important thing actually is, you know, we recognise through these impact thresholds that talked about in the paper that in severe disruptions or severe changes, there are impacts. So this isn't about having a situation of no impact at all. It is about understanding what's an acceptable or tolerable level of impact on outcomes and designing resilience to meet that, which I think is a much better way for organisations to look at it, to understand, look, things do go wrong. That can be acceptable. What we need to do is build resilience to a point where they don't go so badly wrong that either, you know, we fail or more importantly, we fail our customers and we fail society at large.
I think there's an interesting distinction which is drawn out in the chat about the COVID being a sort of rising tide event as opposed to a sudden no notice event and an immediate crisis. And I think also related to that is that not only is it a rising tide event, but it's one, as Mike Butler said a moment ago, has gone on for much longer than people initially assumed. You know, you think back to this time or the beginning of last year, the idea that this crisis was going to go on more than a few months was actually very narrow. And so, you know, that's really a very important distinction. So do you think the nature of being resilient and being a resilient organisation is different for rising tide? Another example would be climate change, rising tide events as opposed to sudden events, sudden crises. David's nodding, so I don't know.
Well, yeah, a couple of points there. I think I've worked on a lot of crisis disaster events across all different sectors in the past, and what's quite interesting is that very few of them are sudden shocks. When you actually look, they are all made up of lots of things that go back over a long period of time through quite a long incubation period before the disaster hit. And in most of those disaster crisis events, there were probably plenty of opportunities for organizations or individuals to notice, to intervene, and to make a difference. And I think that is the challenge that we have with all events that are kind of slower moving events, is that if they are made up of lots of contributory factors that individually wouldn't be able to defeat the system, but in combination they do. That's why it's so difficult when we look at the interdependencies in the system, because we don't know how they're going to combine to create an event. And so we don't attend to those smaller issues. And what we don't tend to do then is also look longer term and say, this could happen and we focus on the consequence, what we tend to do is focus on the probability and say it's such a low probability event, therefore we're not going to invest in it. Whereas actually, I like this idea of shifting away from threat-centric resilience to more threat-agnostic resilience, and saying this event might not happen, but a disruptive event will happen. Therefore, can you remain in your impact tolerance levels? Can you deliver your core services regardless of the threat or the disruption? And I think that's a much healthier way to think about building resilience for the future.
Yeah, and I think, David, in the report, that's where, as well, the stress testing is so important. And I think for many aspects of organizational resilience, if we get the stress testing right, that will actually make a substantial difference. We've seen the effect it's had in terms of financial resilience in the financial sector. The use of stress testing has made a huge difference. And I think there's real opportunities to look at how we use stress testing for organizational resilience more broadly.
I completely agree as well. And I think that there's a great picture and slide on page 15 in the report, which has got the sort of the impact over time for against the 5 capitals, but which I think brings to life some of what we were just talking about. But there are some events still that do have that sudden shock, which are mostly now the cyber events, right? Cyber attacks. So while a lot of the events that we would deal with that are going to have a massive disruption or major disruption to a company or a country, or to a point might be a rising tide event, some of these cyber events, ransomware, etc., do have that. And so as long as you're planning your resilience around that full distribution of potential impact in terms of timelines, then you are resilient.
A number of the comments and questions relate to how do you get the C-suite to take all of this seriously? Do you have to create a financial driver which says this is going to impact on the bottom line adversely unless you do something? Or how do you get over the "it won't happen here" syndrome? Did you feel that in terms of the research that it was because of the foresight of individual leaders that they were able to cope with this? Or is there some other driver, apart from obviously getting them to read the report?
Yeah, do you want me to pick up on that again? I think there's a couple of things there. Might want to come in, my subtly on this as well. One, we did really notice in those organizations that and we said this, resilience was like a social contract. Those leaders really felt like they had an obligation. It was part of their legacy. It was part of what they did to ensure sustainability of their organizations, but also to have no impact or no negative or reduce the negative impact on society. So this notion of a social contract, I think, came through very loud and clear in those organizations. I think one of the other things is this shift to stress testing the system and thinking about impact thresholds, thinking about what's essential. Actually, that focus on the end user, on the customer, on the member of the public that is benefiting from your service, that focus, that's just good business, really understanding and then mapping how you deliver that service from end to end, surface to core, really helps you understand your business. And the focus around impact thresholds, when you say, well, given this nature of this, if you don't have these staff, you don't have these facilities, these resources, you cannot remain within your impact thresholds, and you can measure that and you can even model it, then it becomes a strategic issue, and it becomes something where you say, well, okay, I do need to invest in this, because it becomes much more tangible, much more measurable in terms of the essential outcomes. So, seeing resilience as being divorced in some way to everyday management and leadership, I think, is one of the things that we moved away from. It was just everyday good practice about delivering the essential outcomes this time, next time, and every time.
If I can just add a little bit onto that as well for, sorry, Mike, just from my experience of as a sort of practitioner of resilience for the last 5-6 years, there are unfortunately a lot of members of the C-suite now and executive management that have lived through events that, had they had resilience in place, would have been a much lower impact event. So there's a bunch that fall into the category of, I'd never want to live through that again. And so they get it and they understand it and they support it. There is a much, much stronger customer and colleague focus. So it's that social contracts focus now from executives, I would say, now than there was perhaps 20 years ago in the C-suite and executives. And so ensuring that our customers are looked after, they can continue to transact, they can continue to get the services how they want, when they want, and our colleagues can feel safe and secure and do the same thing. It's something which I think has culturally changed quite a lot at the C-suite and the executive level as well. And then thirdly, in some sectors, such as mine in financial services, the regulators are very helpful in setting their standards out and policies out and their expectations out, and putting things like the senior manager regime framework wrapped around it to put accountability in place. But I do think that the carrot for the first two elements there are much, much stronger than the stick. The stick is there only really when companies aren't necessarily, haven't lived through it, or aren't necessarily behaving the way they should do. Sorry, Mike, back to you.
It's the other Mike.
Thanks. No, it was two very quick points, actually. One about the investment. I think the focus on essential outcomes, as both David and Mike have pointed out there, allows a slightly more objective discussion rather than one of risk appetite. It's an agreement and a consensus at a senior level that we must invest in this if we agree that these impact thresholds must not be breached. So that was quite a nice shift that the resilient organisations seem to take. And the other was just a really practical example about David's point, thoroughly understanding surface to core how you are delivering those essential outcomes. One of the utility providers that we spoke to said that lockdown had isolated customers who could only pay manually for their utilities. So they very quickly had to find an alternative way to enable their customers to pay so that they could deliver the essential outcome, which was providing energy to their customers. And by understanding that, and by mobilizing an alternative way to do it, they were preventing really, really serious consequences, which not just had human consequences, human impact, but potentially reputational impact as well, which could have had a really lasting effect on their business. That was all.
This concept of the social contract, which David mentioned a few minutes ago, and I think it follows on from what Mike Sutcliffe has just said, is who is that social contract with? Is it with the customers, but particularly perhaps the vulnerable customers? Is it with the employees? We're all part of this family, and as the C-suite, we owe it to you to get this right. Or is it society as a whole? Is this something that, and this comes back to the whole of society approach, which the government says it wishes to adopt, what's the big driver there? I mean, I think it should be all of them, actually, but I mean, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the way people will see it. So I'd be interested to know what your feeling was about the people you spoke to as part of this exercise, where they saw that wider social responsibility lying, whether it was a narrow interpretation of our regular customers, or whether it was a broader society as a whole, or just us as a family, as an organisation, as an entity which needs to continue.
Yeah. It was who they defined as their key stakeholders, from whose perspective they were looking at those essential outcomes. And I think that's one of the things that was a differentiator, because they looked at those essential outcomes and then said, so if we can't deliver these essential outcomes, what's the impact across the 5 capitals, and who's the stakeholders that would be affected by it? So it was systematically looking across a broad range of stakeholders, because the impact across the 5 capitals will be different for each of the stakeholders. So it was using that to look at this more systemic perspective, looking at multiple stakeholders and multiple impacts, giving that much more systems view of impact and resilience.
Anyone else on that? in which I'll pick up another point from the chat, which I think is interesting, which is that are we in danger, particularly because this has been a pretty mega event for many organisations, of starting to focus just on the big events, the major disruptions, rather than getting people to recognise that actually a better preparedness for major events means you're also able to handle the minor as well? Or do people sort of mentally separate out, this is cataclysmic, I need to do the following, whereas this is sort of normal life and we'll just muddle through?
If I could just touch on that one, and from my own experience and sort of giving some insight to what I've done previously and what I'll continue to do, is that you have to, when you're embedding operational resilience into an organization, part of the, if you like, the ROI of it is that it improves stability every day of the week and availability every day of the week for the services that you're providing to your customers and your colleagues. And so you are strengthening everything and using it every day of the week. And it has to be a core part of it. And that's where you move away from it just being a reactive program through BCM and DR into a proactive assessment of where you may need to make some improvements, which is informed by some of those large threats. But actually all the benefits of having a highly available business service in our financial services language is felt every day of the week, and it should be. And that, you have to, and that's how culturally resilience becomes much more embedded into the DNA of an organization. People are thinking, how can I make this thing better? Not just when COVID-22 comes along or whatever the next one's going to be called, but when we actually have a minor blip in the ability to provide our digital banking to our customers and fix it there and then, make it better, make it better.
Yeah, Mike, I'd agree. And I think, resilience isn't just about having one hardened solution and that's it. Because, if that does fail, and it's always going to be, what if it does fail? It's actually about having flexibility around it and having options. And the more options, the more flexibility you've got, the more resilient you're likely to be. You won't use all of those options, all that flexibility in every event, but, you then got the choices for which options do I use when this, this disruption happens versus a different disruption, maybe a different set of choices and options that you're going to use. So
that's an excellent point, because your resilient solution to my digital banking is unavailable is to tell your customers to go to online banking or use telephone banking or go to an ATM or go to a branch.
Yeah.
And so it hasn't really cost you anything as an organization, but it means makes a massive difference to the customer's experience of being able to achieve whatever the outcome they wanted to achieve, exactly, and being told how to achieve it through better communication. So there are always ways to achieve better resilience that are actually quite simple by just telling people what to do.
Can I just say,
please do.
Yeah, I was going to just come in. So this point about focusing on the big disaster events and not fixing the small stuff and the smaller, or the what might seemingly be smaller thing. Just an anecdote. I ran a session recently for a group of education providers on resilience. So this was exam boards, local education authorities, school leaders, school governors, and so on in the group that I had. And I ran a conversation about what is a disaster, which is actually a great question to anyone to ask in their organization, because what is a disaster varies very differently. And I rarely find a senior management team that can agree on what would be a disaster for their organization. So an intolerable event, and even how you define it. So I was running this session for them. And of course, we're having this discussion about closures of schools and examination failures and not being able to run GCSEs and A-levels. And then one head of a school said, a disaster for me would be one child leaving my school not able to read, write or add up, because the consequence for them, the consequence for long-term for society of that failure will cascade through the system. And, we really need to bring this down and make it personal and think about impact on people's lives. And that kind of stopped me in my tracks, because we were talking at a very different level. But it just shows how you can apply that resilience thinking, delivery of essential outcomes, what's the impact across 5 capitals, and how we might want to think about that at very different levels. And I think that's where the leadership comes in. You know, what is a disaster? For some, it might be being the bottom of a league table. For others, it's the impact on a child's life.
Okay, I'm conscious that we're running towards the last few minutes. I have to say that this understanding what the customer wants and what is critical. I recently had a problem with my internet supply. It stopped working. And now, being a prepared sort of person, I actually have 2 internet connections so that I'm always connected, even if one fails. But it was the joy of listening, because you could only communicate with them by telephone, for into what felt like interminable hours, to a rotating message which said, if you are having problems getting through on the phone, you can always contact us and post your problem online, without recognizing that, of course, this was part of the issue that people had faced. I'm conscious that we are, I think, almost out of time. I think that Ronald Willis has posted in the chat the challenge from his MBA dissertation a mere 30 years ago, when he said the challenge was to turn the organization from an egg to a rubber ball, which I think is wonderful. I intend to continue plagiarizing that mercilessly from now on. I can see quite a number of other people seem to have reacted to that very forcefully as well. So I will now, as we're running out of time, I'd like to thank our speakers, David Denyer and Mike Sutcliffe, our discussants, Rick Cudworth and Mike Butler. Thank all of you for attending, and hand back to Bina from Resilience First to send us all on our way with a song in our heart and a spring in our step.
Well, I'll try my best, but I just want to say it's been a really fascinating hour. We've covered a lot of ground, and on behalf of Resilience First and all the participants, we would like to thank all the chair and the speakers for their great and superb contributions today. A copy of the report will be circulated together with a summary from the report from this webinar as well, after, post this webinar. So finally, do join us at our next webinar, which is on the 20th of May, and we'll be looking at placemaking and building resilient cities. So with that, we say thank you, stay safe, and goodbye. Thank you.